Greetings and salutations.
This is
I am
Dr.
Chad Howard Newton,
PhD graduate
adjunct
from Regent
professor for
Bethel
University
University
in the
Business
College
and
of
Leadership.
Professional Studies.
I am currently
and
an adjunct
working
professor online
in finance
for
and
students
registration
in the
for
College
the
of
University
Professional
of
Studies
Rochester
at Bethel
in
University
the Medical
in
Center.
Tennessee.
Dr. Deborah
I
Dean
teach
is
both
also
undergraduate
a researcher
and graduate
in the
students
chapter
in the
that we
HR
prepared
world,
together
leadership
for the
theory,
Palgrave
organizational
sciences and so forth.
Handbook of Servant Leadership.
It's been a
which is
great
coming
honor
out
to
this
serve
year.
in this capacity,
We are
as
very
I feel
excited
it is my
about it,
calling,
and we want
and
to
my
share
research partner, Dr.
our
Deborah Dean,
topics
who asked me to join
with
her
you.
on sharing a publication in the
The
upcoming
title of
book
our
from
chapter
Palgrave
is called
Publisher.
Repairing the Theory of
The
Servant
book is
Leadership,
called
and we have
the Palgrave
an
Handbook
exegetical
on
and
servant
qualitative
leadership, and we
literature
are very
review
excited
type
to be
of
part of this
approach
series
to
and
the
contributed
study that we
what
did
we
and
believe
some
is a
arguments
useful
that we
chapter
made to the
that we think will be
edited
useful moving forward
textbook.
for practitioners,
Our chapter's
scholars,
name
and
is
students of
Repairing
servant
the
leadership
Theory of Servant Leadership,
and where we could be heading
and
based on
we're just
today's
going to
current
touch on
trends.
some bits and pieces.
And if you want to get a copy of it, the book, I will have some slides at the end. We can click on and pre-order your copy of the book coming out. It is not fully ready for hard copies yet, but it is in the works, and the goal is to have it out this fall if possible. Once again, I continue on in this presentation, just a little bit more about my background. I published 7 articles recently since I graduated from the School of Business and Leadership at Regent University under the mentorship of Dr. Bruce Winston, Dr. David Winner, and a few other scholars, Dr. Cornelius Becker, who I am friends with, and we exchange conversations every day. He is the dean at the School of Divinity at Regent University. He's quite an accomplished man, and him and I both have very similar inspirations and aspirations about our vocations as professors in the academic world. Dr. Dean has been quite helpful and been quite respectful. It has been, I should say, it has been a very, very exciting opportunity to work with her. She asked me to consider working with her, and at first I was a little intimidated because she's been quite accomplished and far more along her career and occupation, and achieved a whole lot more than what I've been able to achieve, especially as becoming a who's who among many people, especially in the subject of women becoming successful leaders in organizations. She's quite accomplished in all of that, and I'm sure she's overcome some challenges because she is a Christian woman. And if you're a woman and you're out there in the secular world, being a Christian woman is not always fun. Especially if you're a Christian man, it's also not always fun. But she's weathered the storms, and she continues to do it every day, and she continues to be a source of hope for me. So I am very honored to share this publication and authorship with her. Once again, the title of the publisher for our book is Palgrave Macmillan, and our chapter is called Repairing the Theory of Servant Leadership. And we're very excited about that, especially when we get into the topics and the themes that we came up with, things that we thought were useful to consider moving forward in the world of servant leadership theory and those who subscribe to it, and those who want to see improvements made forward regarding its theory and its use in contemporary organizations. Alas, we come to a few quotes from the great founder of servant leadership theory, Mr. Robert Greenleaf himself. Although he has left us in this world, his writings continue to be foundational to our understanding of servant leadership and how it is enacted in the workplace, how it takes place and what we should expect, and how we can measure it moving forward. He said in one of his essays, which one called, this one being called The Servant as Leader, from 1970. He says, "Good leaders must first become good servants," which is deeply rooted in the famous saying of Christ in the Gospels, where he says, "I come not to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many." To add to that, Greenleaf wrote in his essay that servant leadership begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. So we move forward now into the overall topics of the paper we wrote. We focus on the dark side of servant leadership theory. As you may have already crossed this type of theme in the fields of, say, for example, charismatic leadership. There is sort of a dark side in the idea of appealing to charismatic leadership behavior or desiring charismatic traits in the leader's behavior. And what oftentimes we see this, one of the common examples is when we hear about some of these televangelists who really preach the prosperity gospels. And what oftentimes happens is people get disappointed. They find out the results don't really match what they were promised. And then they find out that really some of these preachers really did not practice what they preached, that they lived, in fact, double lives. They may even come out and say that they repent to their audiences, but then they relapse and do the same stuff over and over again. And the media and the paparazzi love to glamorize these kinds of things and really mirror on these fallen preachers. But that's just one example that's so commonly really watched on by the public press. We think about the dark side of servant leadership and the idea of what is it that we psychologically really aspire to when we serve. If we really have an image of Christ, as Greenleaf wrote about in his work, well, what components make up that Christ image? This entails two dimensions that I'm addressing. One of them is the idea of Christology, which is the development of a Christ image over the last 2,000 years. People forget that Christianity came out of the Jewish religion, and that Jesus Christ was Jewish, and that Christianity started in the Middle Eastern world. It did not start in the American world where individualism really thrives. It did not start in a theater-like kind of ministry. It started with the ancient practice of sacrifices, where we see in John 6, my body is food indeed, my blood is drink indeed. It's a very tough chapter to digest, especially if you're used to reading scripture from a symbolic perspective, which Ulrich Zwingli would have you do. But if you look at Martin Luther or even John Calvin, you'll see that they still adhere to the ancient tradition of the literalness of the body and blood in the Eucharist. That's how ancient the Christian faith goes back, and how much we should consider about how we create a Christ image in our minds. As we look at all of the different denominations, and then we'll even look at a lot of the breaks of the Catholic Church, as they had their great schism of the 11th century, 5 centuries before the start of the Reformation in 1517. We have all these sort of pluralisms of Christ coming about. And it's an important time to consider what we mean when we say, I'm a servant. What is it in your mind that you think that you're serving to? That is where we kind of cover the idea of a dark side of servant leadership, sort of maybe something that really hasn't been tapped yet. That connects into the need for further qualitative research on servant leadership in relationship to the spiritual and psychological dimensions. And Dr. Dean also went into multiple findings. She has a couple of charts in the chapter about how servant leadership has actually been defined and what it means to different people. Now, briefly, not too much to cover here except the main research questions in the paper. We asked how might followers misperceive a leader's actions as being servant-like based on flawed assumptions about the historical Christ. The other one, what suggestions could be made to reduce the risk of erosion to authentic servant leadership so that its influence may continue to thrive in the academic and organizational worlds. Now, we continue on into the design, the approach, and the perspectives. Overall, we walked into this project knowing that most likely, based on what we were trying to prove, was based on a literature review. And it was a very exhaustive literature review over the last 2 to 3 years, especially during the lockdown. If there was any new research written, and then what was written previously. We did a philosophical analysis from a cultural perspective, especially when we think about the shaping of Christologies according to different denominational biases and new denominations that emerged, and especially with cultural paradigms playing a role in them, considering the developments of new theologies, for example, two in particular, which are feminist theology and liberation theology. In fact, you could even cross-examine the development of these theologies with current movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, and other types of new movements that are coming out at this time. I don't go into all of them, but because the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement are very critical, it's important to sort of examine these movements in connection to the developments of the particular theologies I just mentioned. And especially when we think about the critical race theory and the foundation from where it comes, there's a lot to really discover in those worlds. But I won't go into all of that at this time. Richard Grieg, a former professor at Sacred Heart University, developed the concept of a pluralism of Christs. And what he basically says here, and this goes in connection with the other writers, Hilaire Belloc is a famous historian of the Christian faith and covers much on the development of denominationalism, especially over the Reformation period from 1517 on forward from Europe and into America, and as well as Alistair McGrath's work in historical theology. We start seeing these connections where each denomination led to a new but similar image of Christ, whether it's rooted in the Calvinism that started with the French Huguenots and then into the Presbyterian Church, or if we're going to nationalism, that started with King James I, and once he rolled out his King James version and the Old English of that Bible, how that led to other separations and the development of separationists and the use of the text to justify certain wars. Just a lot of stuff that went on, and the more theologies that were created, the more similar but different images of Christ came into play, and that would require a much exhaustive historical analysis, which I've done, and I would encourage you to do on your own. But once you find them, you'll see, if you just look at Belloc's work, you'll see a very thorough analysis of the times and how they led to, for example, the development of capitalism from the Puritan sect. There's a lot of stuff that's happened and things that we don't really study and think about as leadership scholars unless we've actually gone to a seminary and done a theology study of some kind. Since we are talking about servant leadership and its roots in Christianity, these things interconnect. As Professor Walter Earl Fluker, who wrote the book Ethical Leadership once said, he said the idea of ethical leadership is managing the segments where points of perspective collide. And theologies are types of perspectives. And when they intersect, at points where we think that Christ calls us to serve this way, to believe this, to believe that, to serve that way, or think this way, it's very easy for those things to lead to a clashing point, in which I call the clash of the Christs. Furthermore, Professor Grieg said, in Europe during the Middle Ages, Christian theology was considered the queen of the sciences. And this is absolutely true. In fact, the very concept of a university started with Christendom, specifically the University of Bologna in the 11th century. Hence the word university, root word universal, as in the Greek word katholikos with a K, which we get the word Catholic from. It leads to the whole idea of a universal world where we can discover all of the divine knowledge of our Creator, who is God become human. And theology is considered to be the chief discipline of how we decipher causes. That is the meaning of the word science, as in scientia, the Latin word. So we must remember going forward that not only do we need to consider that we believe that there's a calling to be servants in the name of Christ, but also how that should be carried out. What does that look like? What does it mean to truly serve according to the theologies that we practice? Are we assuming that our images of Christ are the same across the board? How do we know that? For how we perceive Christ in our minds affects how we carry out our own behavior and what we think servant leadership should look like. So if we're not being told, say for example in a church, that Karl Barth's conceptualization of Christ is being practiced versus perhaps the original outlook of Calvin, or say John Wesley if you're a Free Methodist. These things are important because John Wesley would be more sacramental in his theology and his walk of how Christ wants us to actually serve in the world, where Karl Barth and Ulrich Zwingli would be much more rooted in symbolism versus the ideas of sacraments. Moving forward, the main arguments in our paper. First one I like to point out is that research suggests that one's Christology plays a significant psychological role in how one perceives servant leadership and how it should look in action, belief, and the meaning of servant behavior according to one's Christ image. As a result of multiple denominations and theologies being produced since the Great Schism and then going into the Reformation over the last 1,000 years or so, the research that we come up with and we've done leads to the idea that there may be an eventual clash of the Christs, which plays off of that theme of Clash of the Titans. A clash of the Titans may occur if the principle of universal accountability is not consistently emphasized. And what that means, according to Professor Griggs, universal accountability is that all of us, as practitioners of servant leadership theory and being Christian, that we hold ourselves accountable for what theologies we practice, that we're consciously aware of them, that we admit to what they are, and that we discuss that in our writings. We discuss that in Christian universities, especially in Christian universities. What is it exactly that our school practices about Christ? Where do those worldviews and philosophies come from? And why we believe them? What is our evidence for doing so? That's very key, I think, as part of being universally sound, but also being transparent and accountable for why we believe what we believe about servanthood in our image of Christ. And I think this will also help us in the academic world, because the issue that we found since the Reformation broke out is that the idea, the very idea of theology being a science became more of it became less of a science in the minds of academicians and more of a subjective discipline. After all, if Christ is the same, Christ is God, and God doesn't change, then why are there so many theologies popping out? It's a valid question, including going back to the Great Schism from the 11th century on forward. It's important to know that when we discuss, for example, Catholic Christianity, we're not just talking about the Latin Rite Church, or what you know as the Roman Catholic Church. If you study the Catechism of the Catholic Church, you'll learn that the Catholic Church is really composed of 23 different rites. And the Roman Church is really called the Latin Rite Church, and that's only one rite of the Catholic Church. The problem that's happened over time is that when the Reformation happened and when Columbus founded America at the time, and the printing press came into play, English Protestantism is what mostly made it over here and founded colonies. The Latin Rite Church came over in the 1800s and so forth, around 1740s, and really started up here in the eastern coast, around Maine and Maryland. But the Eastern rites did not make it over. What we know is the Greek Catholics, the ones who followed the Greek teachings of, say, St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. John Chrysostom, and so forth. Even St. Augustine, who's the big name for the Latin Rite Catholics, even he was founded in Greek Orthodoxy of the Eastern teachings, not in those founded in Rome. So there's a lot to learn about the Eastern Christianity, and especially in today's world, where we're looking at the issues associated with Putin, but we haven't been taught really that much about the type of Christianity that was practiced in his homeland, which is Russian Orthodoxy. Moving forward, continued arguments from my paper. As I was saying in the previous slide, we believe that historical theology should be considered regarding what each servant leadership researcher believes to be an accurate image of the historical Christ versus the allowance of, we might say, psychologically, socially, and culturally constructed images to emerge and confuse continuously. We must be able to meet and have an accountability about what each of us subscribes to as being a valid teaching about Christ, how that image of Christ should be, because we have to remind ourselves about the historical Christ from over 2,000 years ago versus how images have been constructed about him over the course of 2,000 years. The discipline of Christological analysis, when one creates a servant leadership theory-based study, again, that connects with our previous point. We must consider the connection between the image of serving first and what one imagines to be an accurate Christ image, which we think is very significant when one considers denominational biases and doctrines, seminarian schools, and theological preferences. We come up with a few different Christ images that we believe to be sort of going on in people's minds out there in the world. One of them we call the Christ of hyper-individualism, which we see happening within what we call the Great Resignation of today. And it's not just within the places of employment, but also within church hopping. We're seeing that too. Whatever caters to me, sort of what we call a consumer Christianity that's taken place quite a bit. The Christ of capitalism, as we see going back to the for-profit and the profit-based seminaries, the prosperity gospels, and even the misconceptions about the history of capitalism. Many folks here in the West think that capitalism started with people starting their own businesses. Well, not really. It actually started with the Puritans, who had quite a bit of wealth already coming over from Europe. And it was within that sector that the concept of the wage earner came into play. So it wasn't about really so much about entrepreneurship, but more so about the idea of how much can I be paid for my work, the wage. The Christ of feminism, and we're seeing feminist theologies popping out. There's already one that I bought recently that gives me a basic introduction to the field. But what's amazing about it is how each of these theologies comes into the idea of perceiving certain parts of the sacred text as being sexist, or sort of being based on their times, quote unquote, the times when they were written, especially in the first 3 chapters of Genesis and parts of St. Paul's epistles to the Corinthians, to Ephesians and Galatians. We hear about the Christ of postmodernism, so the sort of reductionism that's going on and deconstructionism of the sacred text, as you might come across if you read Grant Osborne's text on hermeneutics, or Dr. Van Hooser's text about meanings in the texts. And that comes over from postmodernism into today's world of posthumanism, as we see going on with the idea of, as gender just socially constructed. And we'll start seeing, if not already, papers being published that connect the idea of God can do whatever he wants, and he'll create new genders that have already been there or will be there that we just didn't know before, and praise God. I mean, don't be surprised by seeing that. This is how easy it's become to come up with these kinds of images. It's very easy to do today. Next one, the Christ of nationalism, that goes back to King James I. When we think about, again, what Putin is doing, well, when we preach nationalism, just like we say that each state in the United States is sovereign and each nation is sovereign, well, what we end up doing is having clashing of powers. And if you claim to be a Christian nation, then your Christ is rooted in your idea of your nation being sacred and having a sovereignty. And to have sovereignty means you can impose. And you may even perceive that action of imposing as being a servant-like behavior. It's very easy to do that. Last but not least, the Christ of racial or ethnic superiority. Going back to these movements related to gender and race, all of this is coming out, and it's not surprising to see that there are churches and parishes who are subscribing to this philosophy in the name of Christ. We also propose the idea of considering Russian Orthodox Christianity in any evaluations of Putin's Christ image or his behavior as a servant leader, if he in fact believes that he is properly serving according to his image of Christ. And if we believe that we should not impose on his Christ image because each one of our images of Christ in our denominations are sacred by themselves, then what power or authority do we really have to tell him that his Christ image is wrong? That's the crutch of Christological relativism, is that when we start doing that, we start putting limits on how we can define what servant leading really is according to our preconceived images of Christ. It's very easy to do that with all these worldviews and theologies and methods of exegesis mixed into the picture. How much knowledge would you say that you really have about Russian Orthodoxy as a Western Christian? Are you aware that Russia/Moscow was once considered to be the third Rome? First you had Rome, then there was Constantinople, founded on Byzantium. Then we had, moving into the 20th century, the third Rome, considering possibly Russia or Moscow being the center of Christian teaching. What really sort of got mixed into Russia was the development of communism that really took place there, and you're seeing some of that played out even now today. Which leads us to this last question in this bullet point: is Putin acting out what he believes is the correct form of servant leadership according to Russian Orthodoxy? These questions we believe should be asked. So taking away the key points, we discussed the threat of a future clash of the Christ taking place. An extraordinary convolution about what servant leaders do should be considered and resolved. in papers going forward. We have a concern about the erosion to servant leadership theory from a practitioner-based perspective. We ask the questions about idealized sacred image. Should that leaders desire to serve through in order to properly serve the needs of followers? We recommend that us here in the Western world, as scholars, incorporate a thorough and full understanding of Russian Orthodox Christianity into our leadership studies. We also recommend in the paper to consider creating a semi-annual or annual symposium, multidimensional symposium, to protect servant leadership theory, to maintain a sense of historical Christology, to preserve a sense of universal accountability among all of us as Christians from our various denominations, no matter if we're Protestant, if we are Catholic, and no matter what rite of the Catholic Church we're from, or if we're one of the Eastern Orthodox who are non-communion with Rome, but yet still Orthodox and of the ancient Greek Eastern Christianity. Last but not least, we thank you for taking the time to get some glimpses of our work. If you would like to read the paper, please send me an email. I've attached my email address here as well as the email of Dr. Dean. You may get ready to buy a copy from the first two links I put into this slide. I've also shared some links to our publications, both our shared and separate ones. I've shown 3, and then Dr. Dean has 2 links under hers, but they are links to multiple publications that Dr. Dean has done. She's way ahead of me in number. We thank you so much to be a part of this forum on servant leadership theory. We hope that we provoked your intellect, that we've encouraged you to come forward and ask questions, and that we can be of better service to you in the future and consider future research that would enlighten our organizational leaders, our scholars, our researchers, and our students in the academe. God bless you. Go in speed. And as the Lord once told me in a prayer chapel about a few years ago, he said 3 words to me: go in peace.